stimulates your flexors and extinguishes your extensors. And it's the balance between the rubospinal tract, and it'll come up later, the vestibulospinal tract. The vestibular spinal tract isn't a specific nucleus. It's kind of spread throughout the whole brainstem. That is for your extensors. So the balance between the rubo and vestibular is for postural tone. So next what we have is the superior and inferior colliculus. Superior colliculus is for visual. It's a visual reflex center. And then you have the inferior colliculus. The inferior colliculus is a auditory. Well, both the superior and inferior make up what's called a corpora quadrigenum, and that makes up the tectum. And this makes up the tectospinal tract. So the tectospinal tract right there. The reticular formation is what wakes up the cortex. As I said, that will be, if it's damaged, you'll be in a coma, or when you're given anesthesia, it blocks the reticular formation from secreting its chemical messengers to keep the brain awake, keep the cortex awake. And that's what we see right here. All right, next, what we have in the pons, basically, it's cranial nerves 5 through 8, and that's in the pons. And really, there's really no other major nuclei that you need to know. I mean, there's a bunch, but not for what you guys need. In the medulla, remember, the medulla has 9 through 12. That's your cranial nerves. But remember, in the medulla is where you have the pyramids or the desiccations. The pyramids is where you cross from right hemisphere to left body. So that's called a desiccation. So the tract that comes down, right, from the motor aspect of the brain, so your upper motor neurons, they're going to track down through the internal capsule. Right? They're going to go down through the cerebral peduncles. And at the pyramids, the only tract that's left is the corticospinal tract. And at the pyramids, it's going to split. And we said that 90% of the fibers will cross. And that's going to be the lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract. So that right hemisphere goes to left body. 10% stay anterior, and that's your anterior corticospinal tract. So that's where the pyramids are at. Also in the medulla, which I don't have on here, and I'll update this. I'm going to resend it. You have, and this was on the quiz question, you have the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cunatus. Nucleus gracilis, nucleus cunatus. And this is the second order sensory for vibratory proprioception and fine touch from the dorsal columns, posterior columns. From there, they're going to project to the thalamus. So the second order for the dorsal columns. The cerebellum, remember that the cerebellum is needed for fine motor movement, muscle planning, fine motor movement, muscle memory. All right, so cerebellum has, and they're finding out it has more new things that are on the horizon that they're finding out about it. But this coordinates your activities with the motor, upper motor neurons. So when you move, it's not shaky. It's nice, smooth movement. Okay, next we get into the spinal cord. You get into the spinal cord, we have the definitely need to know the anatomy and what their function is. So we have the anterior root. The anterior root, remember, are, where's my pen, axons, okay, of lower motor neurons. These are the axons, so this is the output for motor. The posterior root is first order first order sensory, right? First order sensory is axons. First order sensory axons is your posterior root. The anterior horn is where you have your lower motor neurons. Right? That'll connect to this, and I'll show you some pictures here coming up. So this is where you have your lower motor neurons, and if these are damaged, you'll have these symptoms. Flaccid paralysis, so it means you're paralyzed. Your examiner moves your arm, it's going to be limp. You'll have hyporeflexia or decreased reflexes, so a decrease in the reflexes. You'll have a negative Babinski, meaning that the toe will go down, which is a normal response. You will, over time, have atrophy, shrinkage of the muscle, and you will have fasciculation. So that's what we see with lower motor neurons. The dorsal horn, right? The dorsal horn is where you have second order sensory neurons. Second order sensory neurons. And remember, in the dorsal root ganglion, this was, I think, a quiz question. Your dorsal root ganglion is where you have first order that are coming in for sensory. All right, getting into the tracks, you have ascending tracks. All right, the two main ascending tracks, meaning afferent, is going to be the lateral spinal thalamic tract. Lateral spinal thalamic tract. And remember, that's going to bring in pain and temperature. And I'll take you back to the picture here as soon as I'm done with this. So the lateral spinal thalamic tract is your ascending tract. The other ascending tract is your dorsal columns or posterior columns, which is the fasciculus gracilis or cunatus. Remember, the fasciculus gracilis is sensation for vibratory fine touch and proprioception below T6, and cunatus is above T6. And they don't synapse immediately. They synapse again in the nucleus and the medulla. Again, I'll show you that on the picture. Your descending tract is your pyramidal tract. All right, so again, that's your lateral cortical spinal tract or your anterior cortical spinal tract. But you also have extrapyramidal tracts, and your extrapyramidal tracts, your pyramidal tracts all originate in the cortex. So that's usually a test question. Your pyramidal tracts originate in the cortex, basically in the frontal lobe, where the upper motor neurons are. Your extrapyramidal tracts all originate in the brainstem. And the four main tracts, we've already talked about them, but go through it one more time. You have the rubospinal tract, and that's for postural tone, and vestibulospinal tract for postural tone. The difference between the two is that the rubospinal tract is for flexors, and the vestibulospinal tract is for extensors, for postural tone. Then we have the tectospinal tract, and that is an auditory visual reflex center. So that includes the corpora quadrigentum, which is superior and inferior colliculus. And then you have the reticular spinal tract, which is both ascending and descending, which wakes up the cortex, which then wakes up the body. All right, this is what we went through yesterday. So what you have is for the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, remember the autonomic nervous system, the headquarters is the hypothalamus. Both sympathetic and parasympathetic have preganglion, which is myelinated. All right. And then we have unmyelinated for postganglion, as we talked about. For both, at the synapse, it's acetylcholine. The neurotransmitter, the sympathetic system, is also known as the lumbar, because that's where they come off, or also known as the adrenergic system for their neurotransmitters. Are epinephrine and norepinephrine. And remember that epinephrine is going to stimulate your betas, and epinephrine stimulates betas, and this is going to stimulate alphas. Now remember, betas, you have 1, 2s, and 3s. 1 is excitatory, inhibitory. So 1 would cause constriction, 1 would cause dilatation. So if I have a beta 2 selective, and this is what they use for albuterol, which you guys will be reading about in the next section. Albuterol is used for asthma, and that is a selective beta 2, and it causes vasodilatation, where if I take say propranolol or some type of beta blocker, it can cause constriction. This is why you have to be very careful when you're giving beta blockers to a patient. Right? Albuterol is an agonist, where propranolol is an antagonist. Right? And then alphas are 1s and 2s. So those are your neurotransmitters for the sympathetic system. Here, what we have is the receptors for parasympathetic, which is muscarinic and nicotinic. And muscarinic, nicotinic, and a neurotransmitter for these guys is also acetylcholine, which is one of the most common neurotransmitters. Then lastly is you need to know what muscles are stimulated by what nerve and what plexus they come from. So the only thing in the cervical plexus is going to be the phrenic nerve, and remember the phrenic nerve is C3, 4, 5. Remember 3, 4, 5 to stay alive. Right? So it's phrenic nerve going to the diaphragm. And then in the brachial plexus, you have 5 or 6 nerves. So the deltoid is your axillary nerve for abduction. Latissimus dorsi is going to be thoracodorsal for adduction at the shoulder. Right. At flexion at the elbow, that's the bicep, that would be mostly cutaneous. For extension at the elbow, that would be your tricep, which is your radial nerve. Flexion at the wrist is the median nerve. Extension at the wrist is also the radial nerve. And then your pinky and half of your ring finger is the ulnar nerve. Then in the lower body, your psoas muscle, as well as your quadriceps. Quadriceps is extension at the knee, and the psoas muscle is flexion at the hip, bending over. That's going to be the femoral nerve from the femoral plexus. Then we get to your hamstrings. Hamstrings is the sciatic nerve, and that's going to be the tibial branch. For your gastrocnemius muscle, for plantar flexion, that's also the tibial branch of the sciatic nerve, where dorsiflexion is going to be the fibular branch of the sciatic nerve. So understand their actions, the name, what nerve causes it, and also know the different symptoms that you get between upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. So it pretty much covers a pretty good review of it. And I might have another review sheet I'll send out later. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? Marvelous. All right. And I didn't see the question. Okay. Yeah, no problem. All right. So we're gonna get into blood, but I always play this one movie because it's pretty good on strokes. So, and it's about a 20-minute movie, not to bore you with movies, but I think some of these movies could help you understand a few things. So I'll play this 20-minute movie, and then we'll get into the red blood cell. Now, remember, the red blood cell is new stuff, will not be on Thursday's test, right? And when I say Thursday, I don't mean tomorrow, I mean next week. All right, so let me find the movie and go from there. Here we go. All right. So this is on a little bit on Parkinson's, on how the brain works, and on strokes and how it may affect patients. All right, where are you at? All right, so from here, all right, it's a 19-minute movie. Yeah, this is it. All right, so view, play from beginning. All right, here you go.
Yet another traffic accident victim arriving at the hospital. Every second counts. For this victim has suffered severe head injuries. The danger, damage to one of the body's vital organs. That organ, the brain. Meet Jordan McCann. When he was born, he weighed over 8 pounds. One organ made up 10% of his body weight. That organ was a brain. Why does a tiny baby need a brain of that size? What does the brain do? The brain is the control center for the body. Together with the spinal cord, it makes up the central nervous system. Other nerves extend into all parts of the body. These make up the peripheral nervous system. The nervous system has two functions. Some nerves receive information and carry messages to the brain or spinal cord. Others carry instructions from the central nervous system. The former are made up of sensory nerve cells or neurons. The latter are made up of motor neurons. They go to all parts of the body. Back to the brain. It's grayish-white, and the surface is wrinkled. The surface is in fact a thin layer of cells, the cortex, so large that it has to be folded to fit into the skull. The cortex contains 2/3 of the brain's nerve cells. There are two distinct halves or hemispheres. But what does the brain do? Every movement this baby makes involves the central nervous system and eventually involves the brain. You don't believe it? Watch this. This is an MRI, a magnetic resonance imager. With it, we can see the brain working. So find a volunteer. He doesn't look much like our baby, but his brain works in the same way. Place him inside the machine. A small baby might find this frightening, hence the volunteer. Select the part of the brain you want to examine. The scanner gives sections or slices. Choose the slice you want. And ask the volunteer to wave his left hand. This is a section through his brain. This is what happens when the left hand is moved. We're seeing the additional activity in the brain caused by that movement. It's in a small area of the right hemisphere. Activity means that energy is being used. In the body, energy means oxygen, and oxygen means blood. The scanner is picking up increased blood flow. One part of the brain is stimulated. It's in the cortex on the right side of the brain. This forms part of the motor strip. movements on the left of the body are controlled from the right hemisphere. On the right, from the left hemisphere. Let's look at how a scan is taken. Julia has volunteered. She's a radiographer at the Maudsley Hospital in London, and there's nothing wrong with her brain. First, her head is lined up in the correct position in the center of the scanner. Two lights are used which intersect between Julia's eyes. Scans can take a while, so Julia is firmly clamped into place before she enters the magnet. This is a vertical section through the head. You can see the nose on the left, the neck and the spinal cord at the bottom. The folds in the cortex are also obvious. But the cortex isn't the whole brain. Around the back we can see the cerebellum, a specialized part of the brain involved in maintaining balance during movement. And underneath, a group of nerve centers that connect the brain to the spinal cord. So what's going on in our baby's brain? Well, perhaps less than you think, because many of these movements are random. It's the baby's way of exploring the world. And some are simple reflexes, rapid response movement. They require limited involvement of the brain. Have you ever burned your finger? Well, this is what happens. You pull your hand away. Why? Well, a message is sent along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. From there, a message is sent directly along the motor neuron to the muscles. It's a rapid protective response to get you out of trouble fast and doesn't directly involve the brain. So inside the spinal cord, the signal is received. A connecting neuron is brought into action. This activates a motor neuron, and a signal is sent directly back to the appropriate muscles. You pull your finger away. Alice is 8 months old. She's learned to grasp objects and to move them to her mouth. It's a typical stage of development.
Does she do much rolling at home? Does she like being on the carpet? Sure, it's a very clever trick. A little thing to pick up. Are you going to try that?
It's a big step forward. These activities are thought out and involve coordination of hand and eye. So what happens in the brain when the sight centers are stimulated? Back to the scanner and another volunteer. She'll be exposed to a flashing checkerboard pattern of black and white squares. You can see it there, at the front of the scanner. Once again, sections will be taken through the brain. This time they're chosen to show the link between the eyes, seen here at the top of the screen, and the brain. And this is what happens when the lights flash. Activity is concentrated in one area at the bottom of the screen. This is at the back of the brain, and it marks the sight centers, or the visual cortex. Compare this with the motor area we saw earlier, a completely different part of the brain. In the hospital, yet another test, this time for hearing. Jordan is very young, but already there's some reaction to noise.
What did you do the first time? We don't particularly expect him to turn to sound at this age, but he actually held his breath for a few seconds and things. Just reacted to it.
Another part of the brain is active. This time, two areas will be stimulated. These are the hearing centers. So the brain has many distinct regions. But what's actually happening in the brain? Let's look at one area of development, the motor area. Compare the actions of these children. Soon after birth, kicking and waving arms in a random manner. Within a few months, grasping objects and carrying them to the mouth. By 9 months, picking up small objects with a degree of precision and stacking them. Just over a year old and taking first steps. by 18 months, sorting complicated shapes. A rapid development in a very short time, a development mirrored by changes in the brain itself. This is the brain of a young baby, large, already 1/3 the size of an adult brain. Inside there are many nerve endings, but few connections. Stimulate the nervous system and this happens. The nerve endings seek contacts, and if contact is made, connections are established. So while a baby is learning to carry out more and more precise motor activities, the brain is developing more and more connections. This happens at a very rapid rate. More than half of these connections are made in the first 12 months of life, and most learning takes place in the same period. That's why a baby's brain is so large. Its potential is so great. It's also why the brain is so important, and why it's so heavily protected. In fact, the brain sits in its own suit of armor, the skull. But even with such protection, it can be damaged. This tiny baby may have brain damage. And most of the children in this ward are being treated for damage to the brain. But in most cases, impact is not the main cause of damage. The brain is constantly active. Non-stop reactions take place, even when you're asleep. After all, you still have to breathe, your heart still has to pump, the digestive system still has to work. All of this is due to the brain, and this activity needs oxygen and blood. This scan shows the major blood vessels in the brain. The eyes are at the bottom of the screen. You can see the blood spreading through the network of fine capillaries. This blood supply is vital. In fact, it has to be uninterrupted. The blood supply to the brain takes precedence over the supply to all other organs.
The brain is an unusual part of the body in that its oxygen requirement is very immediate and very high. It can only metabolize glucose within the cells. It uses glucose for energy, and it doesn't have stores of energy as other parts of the body do, like the liver, which has glycogen in it, and so does muscle. So that other parts of the body can last for quite a long time without oxygen, but the brain can only last for a very few minutes.
So what happens if the blood supply to the brain is interrupted? This has happened here. A clot has blocked a major blood vessel. As a result, little blood is getting into the finer capillaries. There's hardly any blood in them. No blood, no oxygen, and the cells die. That's what happened to Jeff Dulson. He was a senior systems designer for a telephone company. He also made musical instruments as a hobby. 6 months ago, he had a stroke. One of the blood vessels in his brain ruptured and the blood supply to part of his brain stopped. The surrounding cells died. His speech was affected, but there were other, more unusual effects.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you a picture, and I want you to tell me what it is and what you do with it. Okay.
Some of the links between the visual recognition centers and the language centers of Jeff's brain have been destroyed.
Yeah, it's for a cork, isn't it? What's it? It's called a cork.
Opened wide bottle.
Yeah.
Pull.
Yeah, that's right. You pull the cork out of the bottle, so it's called a corks. Yeah, good. Right, Jeff. I'm going to say 4 words to you, okay? And one of them's wrong It's the odd one out. Okay, I want you to tell me which one it is and why. Okay. Scissors, knife, fork, spoon.
Spoon.
Okay, why do you think spoon?
I got scissors, knife,
Yeah.
and
Fork and spoon.
spoon.
Okay, why?
Thing. Scissors, knife, fork. Spike. Is that right?
Physical damage to the brain, like Jeff's stroke, is quite common, and it can affect any part of the brain.
Scissors, knife, fork,
Scissors.
spoon.
There are a number of very strange phenomena with strokes where people, for instance, lose the ability to recognize the faces of perfectly familiar people in their families, or lose the ability to recognize shapes of familiar objects placed in the hand, and even may cease to recognize one half of the body and think that it belongs to somebody else. People after strokes have been known to push the affected arm out of the bed because they think someone else has climbed into bed with them, even though it is their own arm.
But in addition to strokes like Jeff's, there are diseases which can affect the brain. This man has Parkinson's disease. Symptoms include uncontrollable movements of the limbs and speech problems. At first sight, the scans look normal. But this scanner can be tuned to analyze the chemicals within the brain. The doctors select a box around the area they think is not functioning properly. It's at the center of the brain and it's very small. The scanner now analyzes the chemicals produced by the nerve cells in this box. The information can be shown as a chemical spectrum. Each peak represents the amount of particular chemicals produced by nerve cells in this region of the brain. The higher the peak, the more of each chemical is present. This is the spectrum for the affected area. Compared to the spectrum for an unaffected part of the brain, the peaks are higher. The brain is producing more chemicals. But what do chemicals have to do with brain activity? Surely, brain activity is electrical. Let's look at a typical nerve cell or neuron. They come in many shapes and sizes. An electrical charge is generated in the cell body. It passes down a long tube called an axon. At the end of the axon, where it contacts the next nerve cell, there's a gap called a synapse. When the signal reaches the synapse, a chemical is produced that passes on the signal to the next nerve cell, and so along the nerve. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters, and it's one of these transmitters, dopamine, that is missing in Parkinson's disease.
It's a very frustrating condition because it doesn't affect intelligence. The people who have Parkinson's disease retain their ability to understand things and to be aware of what is going around them in a normal way, but they are unable to respond to it in a normal way. The affected person may have difficulty mustering their thoughts and getting started with their thinking in order to express themselves. And then they often have difficulty with initiating the speech process and actually being able to utter the words.
Because we don't respond immediately. It doesn't mean to say that we aren't interested or don't care. It's like being trapped inside a shell and unable to get out. You just have to give us a little bit more time.
With luck, these babies will never contract the disease. Only 0.2% of the population does. And if they do, maybe there'll be a cure by that time. so they can enjoy the miracle of a brain whose capacity they will probably never fully tap. A brain whose mysteries we will probably never fully understand.
All right, that gives you a pretty good idea of how the brain input output and how damage to the brain can cause serious problems. Come on, I'm trying to get my screen to work here. Okay, let's get into. Let me take attendance here real quick. Let's get into the red blood cell, and that should take about 45 minutes. We'll call it a day. Let me find it. So I sent you this handout earlier today, and the bottom line, what I want you to know, I'm going to go through all these, is just know the major functions of the final cell. You don't need to know the steps in it being made, but this final row here, and then mature cells, just reticulocytes and megakaryocytes, which we'll talk about. So from here, find it. Yeah, here we go. All right. So from here, I'm talking about the blood. Blood is a connective tissue. And you remember your four basic types of tissues: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, skeletal tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So this is one type of tissue. And it has a bunch of different functions. And those functions being, how do I solve here?